So it looks like we are now live from CEJIL's Facebook page. Good afternoon and good morning to all, depending on where you're following this event from. Welcome to this panel titled Esperanza Protocol, a roadmap towards addressing threats against human rights defenders. This event was organized by the Center for Justice and International Law, CEJIL, the Swedish Fellowship for Reconciliation, SWE4, and Protection International. The event will be held in English and Spanish, and there is simultaneous interpretation available for those who need it. I am Jessica Ramirez Moreno. I'm part of the legal team of CEJIL, and along with my colleague Marcos Noblack from C4, we will be moderating this event. We are here today to talk about the Esperanza Protocol, an initiative led by CEJIL, inspired by the work of human rights defenders across the world, including journalists, activists, lawyers, judges, and social leaders that carry out their very important work in the midst of threats. Defenders play a critical role across the globe in the defense of human rights, democracy, development, and peace. Historically, threats have been used to intimidate them, to inhibit their work, and are pressing human rights issues. Threats are often minimized by authorities, and there's minimal effort to investigate the threats, resulting in impunity. In December last year, along with several local international organizations, experts, current and former mandate holders, some of whom are here today with us, we launched the Esperanza Protocol, a tool that aims to raise awareness about the high cost of threats and their impunity. The Esperanza Protocol takes a stand on the need for public policy to protect human rights defenders and provide guidelines for diligent criminal investigation of threats. We are thrilled to have an amazing panel to discuss the protocol and raise awareness about the high cost of threats. I now give the floor to my colleague Marcos, who will introduce to you this amazing panel and start this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica, for this introduction to the event and to the Esperanza Protocol. I would like to begin with a warm welcome to this wonderful panel. And I also would like to take a moment to thank our speakers for joining us today, early in the morning or in the afternoon. Our guests are human rights defenders, experts, advocates, and promoters of peace and nonviolence, and even survivors of the risks and threats that the protocol addresses. I would like to share a few remarks. Defending the land, the rivers, jungles, and wetlands has become an extremely dangerous human action, which oftentimes remains uninvestigated and unpunished, and many times end up with assassinations or people fleeing their communities to preserve their lives, or end up with profoundly damaged social fabrics that is permeated with terror and silence. Environmental and human rights defenders are threatened for numerous motives, including opposing the construction of a dam that would destroy indigenous ancestral territory, as is the case of Berta Cáceres, or protesting against injustice, or publicly denouncing human rights violations such as the use of sexual violence in the context of an armed conflict. My name is Marcos Knoblauch, and I work with Colombia, with SWE4, an organization that is dedicated to the nonviolent protection of human rights defenders. Today, we gather in this event to discuss and hear from our guests their reflections on the relevance of the work of environmental and human rights defenders, and the importance of the Esperanza Protocol as a tool for their protection. Also in this event, we want to accompany, support, and express solidarity with human rights defenders around the world. Finally, we will love our audience to engage with the panel by sharing your thoughts and questions on the Zoom chat or in the comments section of this Facebook live transmission. Time permitting, we will collect and transmit these questions or comments to the speakers. Now, I will introduce our keynote speaker, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawlor. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me today. I've just reread the Esperanza Protocol, and it really is quite a document, and I'm sure will go, if implemented, of course, a long way towards helping protect human rights defenders. Threats against human rights defenders are an area of major concern to the mandate. Because, as we all know, their work is so awfully important. Human rights defenders are people who dedicate themselves to building civil and just societies where human rights are protected without discrimination. They are defined by their peaceful acts and spirits of solidarity, and all over the world can be seen transforming human rights as they are written in law into material safeguards built into the lives of people and the structure of society. Since I took up the mandate in May 2020, I've been speaking to defenders all over the world on a regular basis. Much of the conversations have focused on the great personal risk defenders run in their work. But I also talk to them about successes, because I do believe that small successes and bigger successes fuels hope and builds resilience. And some of their successes are big and many are small, but they keep the defender going brick by brick to continue their work to build civil and just societies. Defenders are accompanying victims of human rights violations in their pursuit of justice and accountability and advocating on their behalf. They're ensuring that those that are seeking international protection are not denied access to the asylum procedure. They bring people together to engage in dialogue and resolve conflict peacefully. And they often succeed, while at the same time empowering and supporting others, building community, building resilience, and spreading hope. The threats they face seek to put an end to all of this. As the Esperanza Protocol points out, threats against human rights defenders are not without motive. They have an intention and purpose and are perpetrated by those who stand to see their interests and power, whether financial, political, or social, negatively affected. Earlier this year, a human rights defender I met spoke in great detail at an event about well-documented human rights violations committed by their government. Not long after, they began to be targeted with smears by high-ranking government officials. These were then picked up by pro-government media and spread widely. This was then followed by a wave of abuse and threats against the defender online, mainly on social media sites, and among the comments were many death threats. Several months ago, I met a human rights defender who had traveled from their home country to raise the alarm about human rights violations connected to a major transnational company. In the year leading up to their trip, they had received escalating series of threats, and after the intervention abroad, they received a new threat. In fact, several new threats by phone, but this one telling them that they were a dead man walking for having talked to people abroad. These are just two recent examples. If you consult the public database of communication sent by mandate to states, including my predecessor, whom I'm delighted to see here, Michel Forst, you will see just how common such threats are. And from the absence of replies by governments, who are supposed to respond within 60 days, you will see that these threats are too often not taken seriously. Even when responses are forthcoming, often it seems that the authorities aren't making the capacity needed to deal with them available, searching out the specialist knowledge that might be able to make a real difference. This needs to change. because not only do the threats in and of themselves have the capacity to do great moral and psychological harm to defenders, their families, and their communities and allies, and to force them pull back from their work, but often, as my report showed to the General Assembly, they often presage further attacks and most seriously killings. Impunity for threats is one of the great factors contributing to such attacks. States need to increase their attempts to understand them and effectively investigate and prosecute the ones that perpetrate them. The Esperanza Protocol provides a guide for doing so, and so I urge states to examine it and begin to put it into practice. Thank you all very much.
Many thanks, Madam Rapporteur, for joining and for your remarks. We are very grateful for your leadership in addressing threats against human rights defenders and your support for the protocol. I now give the floor to Edison Lanza, who is a freedom of expression expert and former Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Mr. Lanza was part of the many consultations we held with experts as we were drafting the protocol, and his contributions were key to the protocol, particularly regarding to freedom of expression. So, Mr. Lanza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning from the south for everyone. I switched to Spanish and following in Spanish. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Felicitaciones a...
Thank you so much for the invitation. Congratulations to Sahil for the presentation and this protocol that I am guessing was built with the participation and consults during the last 4 years. And I think that it is a fantastic instrument for many, many reasons. The first one being that we don't see at any point that we see that it is a complex thing for the world, complex time for the world, in particular, as far as the human rights defenders, activists, etc. Not only are they facing the classical threats, but that is very exhaustive, but also a general frame. I think it also has an impact on the cultural aspect. I think in the last 4 years we have faced from international organizations and also civil society, a real wave of leaders who have, government positions. We've seen a wave against these human rights defenders, and I think that it is to not stimulate the participation and the civic arena, and also the role that they play as human rights defenders in all these countries. So we have seen that clearly from threats, physical aggression or violence, and we've seen murders of leaders, of journalists who were present in very important places in the region, but also other farms to attack the work of these people. So through stigmatization and public singling from higher authorities and leaders with the ability to send their messages through social media, many of those, with millions of followers, pointing out the defenders and corruption belonging to different parties and how they are against nationalism or anti-patriotic. This is a misunderstood nationalism, kind of. And this has generated an adverse climate for this kind of work. Also, the attack against organizations through through norms and legislation that really do affect the organizations themselves of civil society, etc. Also in the education and academic space, fighting on the subjects that defenders talk about, like the land, or the earth, and sexual and gender and reproductive health rights, and just trying from different angles. And I would say that they are harmonized in a way to close this window. So of course we have to try to rebuild democracy. I was reading something the other day, you know, the revenge of the mega powerful, and it's based on the decision making from a small amount of stakeholders with a lot of power. Therefore, I think that in this context is very important when we present this, because the document, and I read it again, it has a comprehensive scope of things. It is a practical protocol with an effective impact, with the possibility that the justice holders may understand their function, their responsibility, and that they may develop investigations in the context when these threats take place and not get away with impunity, for instance. And also the possibility of clarifying where these threats come from, and that we have to protect lives and to make sure that these people can still fight for human rights. And we also need to determine what centers these threats come from. But we have to say that it also has a contextual and comprehensive angle, and in practically all the countries in the region, this is happening, and they're not seen as small threats. Many times they respond to more complex situations. So of course there are countries and regions where it's much worse, with just like, you know, the first danger that a defender has to face has to do with the right to life, for instance. We have seen painfully how the situation in Colombia has degraded, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and of course in Cuba, you know, with everyone ending up in prison always. And the situation is not really changing in Venezuela either, but also in other countries in the region where there is bigger room to have these human rights respected. But just like I was saying, there are more useful mechanisms, and sometimes they're not as subtle as the social protests that we have seen in the Andean countries and also in Brazil, and of course in other places in the world. I think that this is a good tool that is indispensable, comprehensive, clear, and will have an impact and an authority and a utility, you know, and it's going to be for the justice defenders and for these international organizations and the civil society, and the discussion of what is this amazing task of human rights defenders.
For your remarks, your intervention. We really appreciate your support and contributions to the Esperanza Protocol, and highlighting the relevance of this protocol as a tool for protection. Our next speaker is Viviana Krsticevic, who is the Executive Director of CEJIL, the Center for Justice and International Law. Viviana, the floor is yours.
I think Viviana is having trouble with her microphone. So we are going to give the floor to Michel Forst while Viviana sorts that issue with her microphone. Michel Forst is the Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders elected on the Aarhus Convention and former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation on human rights defenders. First of all, congratulations, Mr. Forst, for your new appointment. It is great news. We're sure that you will do a terrific job, and this is great news for all environmental defenders. Mr. Forst also supported the protocol back in December. So we very much welcome your views on this topic and how your new mandate can continue working on this issue related to threats against environmental human rights defenders. So Mr. Forst, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica. And it's good to see all of you on the screen, and I do hope that we have the possibility to meet in person in Geneva, New York, or elsewhere, and to share our experiences on the use of the protocol. And thank you again to CEJIL for the invitation. I've been asked to very briefly speak on this new rapid response mechanism that has been established last year by the state parties to the Aarhus Convention, and as it is a new mandate that you may want to promote within your organizations. And it also in my plans to look into the Escazú agreement and to share with states and NGOs in the region my plans and my experiences on a new mechanism specifically dedicated to environmental defenders. But I would like also to present my views on how the Esperanza Protocol could be used in my new capacity as Special Rapporteur on environmental defenders. You may know that the Aarhus Convention has been adopted in 1998, precisely on the same year of the adoption of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And the convention is based on three principles or three pillars. One is access to information, two, public participation in decision making, and three, access to justice in environmental matters. And it lays down a set of rules and principles to promote the involvement of citizens in environmental matters and to support environmental justice rights. Whether groups who protest against the construction of a dangerous dam, or individuals or communities who will speak out against harmful deforestation practices in their local community, environmental defenders are vital to the preservation of the environment across the globe. And under Article 3.8 of the Aarhus Convention, state parties shall ensure that persons exercising their rights in conformity with the provision of the Convention shall not be penalized, persecuted, or harassed in any way for their involvement. It is crucial that environmental defenders be able to exercise their rights under the Convention without fear. As you know, state parties, and Mary Lawlor recently, when she presented her report to the Council, NGOs, media, have constantly reported shocking cases in which environmental defenders face dismissal from employment, surveillance, heavy fines, threats, intimidation, criminalization, detention, violence, and even killings for their work, at least in 16 states parties to the Convention. And this is precisely this reason why states have decided last year to establish a rapid response mechanism to protect environmental defenders and to prevent the attacks to occur. And I've been appointed 2 weeks ago by state parties to the Convention. And this is the first such mechanism specifically safeguarding environmental defenders to be established within a legally binding framework under the UN system. It does not require exhausting domestic remedies before seeking protection from the mandate. And this decision marks for me an important step for the advancement of environmental democracy, helping to uphold the universal rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which has been recently recognized by the Human Rights Council. And my role as Special Rapporteur will be to take measures to protect any person experiencing or at imminent risk of penalization, persecution, or harassment for seeking to exercise their rights under the Aarhus Convention. And those measures will include issuing immediate protection measures, including relocation, country visits, raising my concerns with governments and heads of states, using diplomatic channels, issuing public statements, or bringing the matter to the attention of other human rights bodies, the UN, OSCE, Council of Europe, and of course, all relevant UN Special Rapporteurs. There will be also an important role to play in preventing the attacks to occur. As you know, the earlier you can act, the better for defenders in danger. And when I was the UN Special Rapporteur on defenders, I've been invited by CEJIL and by Viviana, together with other colleagues, Special Rapporteurs, to support the development of the Esperanza Protocol. And I must say from the beginning, the very beginning, I've been one of the active supporters and promoters of the protocol. I have indeed seen in all my official country visits in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, but also in Europe, how the lack of concrete measures to fight against impunity can lead to an increased number of attacks against defenders. And when you speak, like I did, and Mary is doing the same, to attorneys and lawyers in countries during missions, you immediately understand that a protocol on the investigation of threats against defenders can contribute to make the issue visible and to break the cycle of impunity. In my new mandate as rapporteur on environmental defenders, I intend to continue to promote the use of the protocol during my country visits and all my discussions with governments and national authorities, as I see that impunity for attacks remains a key driver for more attacks and fuels the cycle of violence against land and environmental defenders. It is clear for me that a protocol on the investigation of threats against defenders can also contribute to implement the third pillar of the Aarhus Convention and would guide states to develop legal instruments, legal practices on access to justice for breaches of Article 3.8 of the Convention. And lastly, the protocol will also guide me and my team as we are currently in the process of developing new tools, new methods of work to implement this very new rapid response mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michel Forst, for your remarks and above all for your work with human rights defenders, and particularly in this new role promoting the right to defend the environment and under the Aarhus Convention. We are looking forward to seeing the Esperanza Protocol used as a guideline for public policies and also promoted among states. So our new next speaker is Mrs. Thea Gorjanc Prelević, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights Action in Montenegro. Thea, the floor is yours. The mic, please.
Okay, can you hear me? All
Yes.
set. Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Sahil, for inviting me to take part in such an esteemed panel on such an important topic. I remember sitting in the CEJIL office in Washington, D.C. over 20 years ago, about the time the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders was adopted. I was sitting next to a human rights defender for Colombia who suffered 3 attempts at his life before CEJIL took him in a part-time refuge. I felt so humble in his presence, and I still feel the same when talking and thinking about all those human rights defenders worldwide who have risked their lives and lost them to improve the lives of others. I think they should be recognized worldwide as local heroes of global consciousness. Their selfless lives and what they stood for should be continuously promoted and honored. And I see the Esperanza Protocol also as an appropriate, proactive memorial to honor them. There can be no human rights if the state denies the very right of their protection. I was recently horrified to learn about numerous murders of human rights defenders in the Americas only in the first 4 months of this year. I wonder, why is the information on the global situation with human rights defenders not on the agenda of this session of the Human Rights Council? Maybe I missed it, but I have not seen it on the agenda. We cannot think about the state of any particular rights without at the same time considering denials to defend them. I think we should be reminded briefly how rare and precious human rights defenders are. They're ready to stand alone, to swim against the current and make sacrifices for others and the greater good. I think such people should be nurtured from an early age and systematically, of course, protected from peril in due time. And the Esperanza Protocol thoroughly considers all mechanisms for timely response. The question remains now for us how to best put it into action in the face of corrupt authorities, lacking independence and impartiality, or at best, lacking time or capacity to react timely. On the bright side, I intended to share some positive achievements from Montenegro in creating a more favorable environment for the human rights defenders. At the end of last year, the criminal code in Montenegro was amended to provide for the stronger protection of journalists. Higher penalties were prescribed for qualified forms of several criminal offenses, such as endangering safety, aggravated murder, serious bodily injury, and coercion, when committed against a person who performs the job of providing public information in connection with the performance of such work. Now, journalists in Montenegro were most often victims of attacks, even assassinations, threats, and abuse. And therefore, our NGO advocacy was tailored primarily at their protection. But the definition of a person performing the job of informing the public is wide enough to be applied also to other human rights defenders as well. The important feature of this achievement was that the amendment of the criminal code was proposed by an NGO, Human Rights Action, 10 years ago. Along the way, the Trade Union of Media joined us and several other Montenegrin NGOs. So ultimately and remarkably, the amendments were adopted across the political spectrum unanimously, with all 70 MPs present voting in favor. Now, we highlighted this unanimous position of the Assembly as uncompromising unified political resistance to any kind of violence against journalists and obstruction and prevention of their work. I wanted to highlight some important issues promoted by Esperanza Protocol, such as protection of privacy and data. In relation to a case we had of a civil society organization fighting corruption, MANS in Montenegro, where the court determined that several activists were victims of illegal surveillance by the authorities. The courts awarded them compensation of damages, but no criminal responsibility of any state officer was ever determined. I wanted to use this example to warn against the trend of what appears as buying off criminal liability with compensation from the state budget, or financing impunity with taxpayer funds, which often occurs also in cases of police torture, as well as in the case of ineffective attacks on journalists. It is much easier for the authorities to pay compensation only and not prosecute corrupt state officers. An especially useful feature of the Esperanza Protocol, I believe, is its focus on highlighting effective protection policy. There was a good practice established in Montenegro to demand from the police, for example, to assess the personal risk, a personal security risk for those who received threats or engage in risky activities such as organizing public events promoting LGBTIQ rights. This proved an effective way to attract the attention of authorities and provide for timely police protection. Now, we're a country where the most prominent gay rights activist was forced to seek asylum because the threats against him were never investigated. And finally, I think the most useful part of the protocol is its B part, the principles of investigation, which provide for an especially useful checklist outlining components of the standard of effective investigation that is, for example, demanded by the European Court of Human Rights under the prohibition of torture, protection of the right to life, and also right to private and family life. It is very useful that such requirements of an investigation would have been outlined. And furthermore, the protocol provides for a very useful advice on how to achieve thoroughness of the investigation, which is one of the components of the standard. The problem we face, I believe in many countries such as Montenegro, where the state prosecutors are in charge of the investigations, they have never received particular training on investigative techniques or even basic steps to be taken in order to identify perpetrators, because they rely on the police to do that. But when the police is an abuser, when they need to investigate the police, then they have a problem and they are incapable to undertake direct and adequate investigation. And of course, another problem is lack of motivation of investigative investigations. For effective investigations, the protocol rightfully highlights that independence and impartiality is key and should guide the justice system at each stage of the proceedings. However, this is easier said than done when the authorities are inherently corrupt and when they order threats and violence through state security forces. When the state administration is connected to mafia or other criminals, our only hope, I believe, may be provided by instigating an enormous public pressure. This is at least what we as NGOs can do to support our colleagues facing corrupt authorities. So I propose a global solidarity network initiative, a coalition of CSOs ready to act rapidly, put pressure and demand protection of human rights defenders worldwide while calling upon the Esperanza Protocol. I intended to rest with that. Thank you. I just wanted to mention the platform that exists in the Council of Europe for protecting journalists. It resembles what Mr. Forst has mentioned, the Rapid Response Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dea Gorjanc Prelević, for your intervention and for bringing examples on how the protocol in Montenegro is being used and applied and highlighting the strengths of the protocol in your context. Indeed, the lack of investigative techniques of state prosecutors is in fact one of the key obstacles when it comes to carrying adequate investigation and prosecution, and that would, in the end, provide a protective effect for human rights defenders. So we will try to go back to Viviana. Hopefully the technical issues are solved. Viviana is the executive director of CEJIL, the Center for Justice and International Law. So now, Viviana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Good afternoon to those in Geneva, and good day to everybody joining us online. It is truly an honor to be in this virtual table, sharing the space with such an outstanding group of panelists, inspirational panelists, and brilliant minds supporting the Esperanza Protocol. The world that we want to live in and the one that we fight for needs of the vibrant and persistent work of human rights defenders. We always say that there are no rights possible if those that stand up for them cannot do it freely. And the Esperanza Protocol states that threats erode a cornerstone of the protection of human rights worldwide and contributes to shrinking of the public space by interfering with the work of human rights defenders. In this presentation, I will try to highlight 5 aspects that I think are key and our contributions, specific contributions of the protocol to the effective response to threats against human rights defenders. First, I think that the protocol puts a legal and political focus on threats against human rights defenders and unveils some of the lesser known aspects of the phenomena of threats. It shows how threats have an immediate and significant impact, affecting not only human rights defenders themselves, but their families, their communities, their organizations, their clients, if they're lawyers, their readers, if they're journalists, and societies as a whole. And the Esperanza Protocol shows that threats then have a rippling effect on the functioning of the rule of law, on freedom of expression and democracy. The protocol also underscores the fact that there is little attempt often to investigate threats resulting in impunity. And as Michel Forst rightly said, that impunity enables additional harm to defenders, but also fuels the cycles of violence and further inhibits their work. Moreover, countless human rights defenders are assassinated following an investigative threat, and it happened with our dear colleague and friend, Berta Cáceres, an indigenous leader that was working in environmental issues in Honduras, and who inspired this protocol. The protocol is also mindful of the differentiated impacts of threats, for example, the gendered nature of threats. One key illustration of that happened with Soraya Gutierrez, a Colombian human rights activist that was sent a doll that was painted with red paint, and it had that doll had a little note on her saying, "Take care of your family." And she was a young mother that truly feared for her daughter and for herself. The protocol also shows how threats often do not occur in isolation. They happen in the context of other crimes or lead to another violations of domestic or international law. For example, threats are oftentimes used to harass prosecutors and lawyers and witnesses that are pursuing accountability for crimes against humanity, as in the case of Soraya, for example. And in this spirit, the protocol highlights how threats are often parts of patterns of harassment and of silencing of defenders worldwide. A second aspect of the protocol that is very important is that it brings to light how several human rights violations occur because of threats and uninvestigated threats. In that regard, there's an interference with the right to defend rights. Oftentimes, threats are destined to limit freedom of expression or association. And at times, threats can be part of a pattern of torture or inhuman and degrading treatment. Actually, the protocol has a detailed analysis showing how threats against human rights defenders infringe internationally protected rights. A third aspect of the protocol, which we think is an important contribution, is taking into account the nature of the phenomenon. The protocol gives tools to look at patterns of threats and associated crimes. This is important because it facilitates the adoption of public policies and criminal policies. Actually, the protocol itself has a specific chapter on guidelines for public policies and on guidelines for criminal policies that are important for looking at these patterns and trends that can help prevent attacks against human rights defenders and killings of human rights defenders. These guidelines enable pertinent policies for protection and also facilitate a type of prosecution that can aim higher in terms of who gave the orders for threatening and killing people. And also it can aim broader. It can actually help unveil some of the networks that are behind crimes and patterns of crimes against human rights defenders. This is a pretty novel approach in most global protocols, but is inspired in part in the Latin American Protocol on Femicide, which has some elements of looking at criminal policies, and also at domestic experiences with strategic criminal prosecutions in national jurisdictions, where prosecutors and judges have thought through on how to investigate patterns of violations. A fourth aspect of the protocol that I think is interesting is that, as many other global protocols, it has a step-by-step guide on how to investigate threats, taking into account the fact that human rights defenders are being threatened. And it also gives guidance on associated crimes, drawing from additional global protocols. However, given some of the practical difficulties in investigating under certain circumstances, for example, investigating when there are state authorities involved, as Thea mentioned, or sometimes when children are the victims, or when the threats occur online, we saw fit to include additional criteria on how to investigate threats linked to the type of threats, the modalities of threats, the type of potential perpetrators, or the targeted victims. Consequently, the protocol gives enough direction to tailor some of the measures, the investigative measures, taking into account the specific nature of the crime that needs to be investigated. And fifth and last, I want to highlight the community behind the protocol. This process started as a way to create a path for change for an entrenched practice of closing spaces and shattering lives. We've seen it with thousands of our friends and colleagues in the human rights community. And we did it because we wanted to live in a world that what happened to Berta Cáceres was not possible again. And this process was a robust process that included 6 years of sustained work and regional and thematic workshops and 6 specialized committees and insights and support of hundreds of defenders, dozens of prosecutors, experts, policymakers, key organizations working on the protection of human rights defenders, and over 18 current and former mandate holders at the UN and the regional level. And as a result, the norms and the standards included in the document systematize the applicable international legal standards, but its content is also informed and inspired by comparative legal frameworks and practical experiences of prosecutors, jurists, defenders, and experts. So given the process behind it and the specific contributions of the protocol and the allies that this document has been able to foster even after its formal adoption, we are hopeful that many other mandate holders, journalists, prosecutors, institutions, organizations, even courts and governments will find it useful to foster a more robust set of guarantees for the defense of the rights of all, and particularly for defenders at risk. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Viviana, for your remarks, and thank you for your leadership and commitment over the years to bring to life this protocol to protect our team of defenders, our colleagues who defend rights, and defenders all over the world. I also wanted to highlight that there are at least 16 countries who are, well, people are joining from at least 16 countries. So thank you for following the event. And for those who are just joining. This is the title of the event is Esperanza Protocol, a roadmap towards addressing threats against human rights defenders. I'm going to give the floor now to Mr. Diego Gargía Sayán, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Independence of Judges and Lawyers and former president of the Inter-American Court. Mr. Gargía Sayán has been an ally of the protocol and an ally of CEJIL and the human rights movement. And yeah, we welcome your remarks on your new report and how your mandate has used the protocol. So Mr. Gargía Sayán, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Me siento muy a gusto de poder participar en este.
Thank you. I am so thankful to be able to be with you, with these distinguished people who are focused on the human rights in Latin America and the rest of the world. Congratulations to CEJIL and all the organizations that have participated in the implementation of this protocol, which is very important, and the reason why I highlighted this in the report that I presented to the Geneva UN meeting weeks ago. Many of these people are lawyers or have work in the advocacy arena. So they are thermometers of human rights effects that we see is degrading, which is also having an effect on human rights defenders who, like I said, many of them are lawyers. The Council of Human Rights, we were able to send information on the definition of human rights defenders who were affected, like the Philippines, Russia, Morocco, Palestine, Pakistan, Iran, Rwanda, Turkey, among others, in a way that we have situations where we have institutional and political situations that cross each other in more democratic contexts. And so different stakeholders are providing this type of results that many times are state officials and sometimes are from organized crime. We found also, just like in organizations of lawyers that are supposed to defend lawyers, and many times these are operational tools and used for authoritative people. All these, we draw one conclusion, and the reason why we are here today, that instead while facing these threats, we have to have a state guarantee to protect and guarantee the activity, the life, and the exercise of the defenders of human rights, many of whom are lawyers. The Esperanza Protocol has the virtue about the basic principle of the function of these lawyers. From 1990, they have operational tools that are very concrete, very clear, that guarantees the state to investigate and have a follow-up and prevent these threats against the defenders so that they can have tools to function and operate. And that is why it is very important that we do everything we can to defend this protocol. And we have to use and apply this in situations that, that there may be a lot of resistance in certain countries, so they have to be able to see that this is a very important tool so that everyone who's being persecuted and so that these defenders can have enough reaction and control of the situation. And okay, so with this, I want to end the function of the work of these lawyers who defend human rights. I think that it is a point that is very important. They are a target. We have publications between lawyers that have been intercepted, and that is why Well, adding in to the basic principles in 1990, I think that this protocol is a very important tool, not only for Latin America, but for the world entirely. In Latin America, we've seen also in Europe a tool that can be very important, and maybe we should all use. It is the inclusion given in the Council of Europe this year to prepare a convention for protection of lawyers, including, of course, those who defend human rights. This discussion is starting. I think that they have a very important presence, so it's done through a linking tool. But I think what's very important, and it could interest us all over the world, is that we have the possibility that this convention done in the European Council stay open so that we can add countries that aren't necessarily members of the European Council. In a context like the one we have, would be very difficult to see a universal convention that can work in this context. This is what I wanted to highlight, to add this point, and in this process to implement the Esperanza Protocol, that it may play a very important role so that we can have a follow-up. So congratulations one more time to CEJIL in particular. I just thank you one more time for the opportunity so I can share my remarks brief with such a distinguished panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diego Sayán, for joining us today and for highlighting the impacts of risks and threats that affect, in a different way, lawyers who defend human rights. So our next speaker for today is Enrique Eguren, who is a senior advisor of Protection International, but also is someone who has written and guided many human rights defenders and created perhaps one of the tools that many of us are using today as a guide for the protection of human rights defenders through nonviolent methods. So Enrique, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Marcos, for your introduction. And it is an honor for me to be present here in this distinguished panel, really, representing and commenting on this very important and unique protocol that will be very useful for everybody working on human rights, but also for situations that we try to be by the side of the affected people and victims. I am in agreement with everybody here and everything that I've heard, but I think I can add a couple of things regarding the utilization of this protocol. I would like to focus a little bit, and I want to clarify that I don't have any legal training, but I want to highlight the importance of the protocol in the legal field. And there is something that we sometimes don't think about in the situations, and it is how grave these threats could be to life or to physical integrity. And this protocol also focuses on the barriers that we encounter when we try to defend these people. These barriers are not as visible sometimes, but they are present and they are constant in the lives of people who defend human rights. So when there are powerful actors that see their interests affected by the action of these defenders, it is clear that they will react in different ways. And when they react violently, even if this violence is not explicit and it's implicit through threats, we understand that in all these occasions that these threats are a way for them to govern. In other words, some of these powerful actors, they reserve the power to establish what is acceptable and not when we talk about human rights. So they use these tools as a method of governing to define what is acceptable or what can be done only from their standpoint. And they define on this way what can somebody do to work or contribute. And obviously there's always an explicit threat and an implicit threat that is included within. So when the threats are not isolated, but they are constant and they form different patterns or structures within the structures of power, that is a power agenda. And many times it is the state that brings up these threats, and the state governs utilizing these threats. And sometimes private actors like companies or large companies that are associated with the states take part of these practices, and the government ignores these actions depending on what's at stake. Another thing that I think it's important about the Esperanza Protocol, and I insist, it goes beyond the legal aspect. Obviously, the legal aspect is important, but beyond that, the protocol establishes the steps to follow in case of the governments that need to react before these threats, and they need to have a method to react in, to assess and also take action. Even if there are no legal steps that are necessary, the government is always involved. And I think this protocol defines in a better way what a threat means, not only from a legal standpoint, and I insist, but also from an operational standpoint that is connected with the legal aspect. I think that is very important. And I know that it hasn't been easy from the contribution standpoint to this protocol. This has been one of the most interesting conversations from a philosophical and moral and practical standpoint. I also believe that this protocol has contributed to create a bridge between different spheres of action. I think there's a connection between the threats that are communicated or verbalized and the implicit threats, which are like the promises or the intentions that can be inferred. And like Viviana said, that bridge that is built between a promise, if the threat is not heard, and the threat itself can point who the perpetrators are. And this allows us to create a connection to allow us to investigate from a criminal standpoint or legal, but also from a social responsibility as a society and from a political standpoint. So this bridge created by the protocol is also a bridge to fight the stigmatization that people who defend human rights face every day. And this protocol allows us to expand our view over the threats and to appreciate how things connect to each other. Also, another contribution that is very important that I think has been mentioned, but I would like to highlight, it is that it offers a course of action when a state entity or a government entity is the perpetrator of the threats. So this protocol allows us to understand how we have to proceed. And finally, I would like to mention that the protocol, the Esperanza Protocol, is very important because it gives an intersectional focus and a gender focus that allows us to evaluate how to defend people that work in very violent environments. For example, in rural areas that are in conflict zones, it's almost normalized. And some of us have lived through this. It's very normal to get threats all the time, especially in the outskirts of cities or in peripheral areas. And we have become accustomed to this, but it shouldn't be like that. The threats that are directed at people who defend human rights should be considered as grave as they are. If there is somebody with an important position in a city or a government that receives a threat, that threat is going to be widely publicized. But if a person who lives in a more precarious situation receives these threats, somebody who is poor or somebody who is talking about something controversial, sometimes these people get ignored. And the protocol really highlights that everybody should get the same coverage and response against threats, because we should never differentiate between who receives the threat or who considers this threat as something, as an everyday thing. So this is something that we should avoid. And the protocol really takes a step forward to address these threats. And I think that that is a very important initiative. And once again, I would like to thank CEJIL for this initiative. And once again, I am at disposal for anything that you might need. Thank you again. For your contributions now or during the process. And thank you for focusing on the barriers against the right to defend rights and how the threats form these barriers on the rights that we keep defending, and for helping us understand how this works and how the powerful actors operate when they threat. So now I would like to give the floor to Yirley Velasco, which is a human rights defender from Colombia, and she focuses on the defense of reproductive and sexual rights, and she helps women victims of sexual violence in Colombia. And it's a pleasure to have you with us. Yirley, the floor is yours. Good morning, and first of all, I would like to thank you infinitely for this space, for this opportunity. I would like to introduce myself briefly. I'm Yirley Velasco. I represent many women victims of sexual violence. I am a survivor of sexual violence myself here in Colombia, where in spite of all actions, we still suffer this violence, especially women are impacted greatly. I have been a victim of threats. I have been fighting for 5 years, fighting against these types of violence. And somebody said, and I was listening to them, because my family has been affected by all these threats. Not only myself, but also my family. We all had to leave our area. We had to move many, many times. And at least we have some cautelar measures given by the Inter-American Commission for Rights. And I've had them for 2 years. And besides that, I have some other actions that have allowed me to keep working and actually to stay alive, to be honest with you. But none of the promises have been delivered, because they tell us that we don't have any economic resources, and without the budget we cannot do anything, and that is the response that we get over and over. And like I said, I am a survivor of sexual violence. I have been a social leader for over 20 years, defending women that have also faced sexual violence, girls, boys, men. We also work with women that are incarcerated for the reproductive rights and sexual rights here in Colombia. I am in a very complex area. The Mountains of Maria is one of the most affected zones in terms of violence, and every day grows more and more. There are more groups outside of the law, and these groups still exist in Colombia. And besides all the threats and the displacement that I had to go through, the violence, sexual violence that I had to suffer, have also been stigmatized by the government. For every administration, even at the municipal level where I live. But I also wanted to highlight that I don't get stuck there, but I keep going, and I go with the processes of the different communities, and I keep up with them. Every day I fight to advance, to stay alive, for my family, for all the women that are still silenced. Being a social leader is not easy. It's not easy at all. And listening to all the people participating of this panel, I do believe that it is critical that we apply the Esperanza Protocol, because it contemplates what all the defenders of human rights live through every day. It is like one of us is speaking right there. This is our daily lives. This is our daily life. This is our fight. And we could say that I feel heard when I listen to this protocol. I feel that my life is reflected and my fight is reflected. So I thank you immensely. And also, I thank you for this space. I have enjoyed listening the viewpoints from everybody. I am happy to have this space. And I want to share with you briefly the work I do with Sembrando Vidas. And the threats have not been directed at me personally, but at the whole of the organization. Many of these women working with us have expressed their concern. They said, I don't want to speak up because I feel that I am going to get killed. Many people feel that they are going to be assassinated, and many people are not being heard. And they have, and a lot of people get dismissed, and they say that our threats are false or invented. And who is going to invent such a great threat, like the threats I had received? So anyway, I would like to repeat one more time, I am very thankful, and I feel heard, and I feel contemplated by this protocol. And I think part of my fight is immortalized there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Yirley, for being with us, for sharing your story, your work as a defender of women's rights, and to show how these threats and the risks do have a direct impact and immediate impact, and very strong on your life, your family, and the people with whom you work. We hope that this protocol can truly be a tool also for your protection, for that of women, and people that you work with. Our last guest today, we are going to give the floor to Adolfo Pérez Esquivel. He's an activist for peace. He is a human rights defender his entire life. He's an artist, and he received the Nobel Prize of Peace. We are so happy to have him, to have Adolfo with us among us today. And so the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be able to share with you and add Esperanza Protocol so many actions that have been developing in the world of the human rights defenders world. I am a survivor of persecutions, not only in Argentina, but also in Brazil, in Paraguay, in Chile as well. Our focal point, if we talk about, of course, many problems everywhere in the world, Africa, the situation in Palestine and Iraq, and but our work really is focused mostly on Latin America. I have listened to everyone, and I share with you the same. And I remember Cáceres, but also I remember Chico Mendes for defending Floresta. He was murdered. And I'm going to be very brief. The human rights and democracy are indivisible values. If human rights are violated, the democracy gets weak and it stops being democratic. Also, human rights organizations are to really stop people's pain. It goes way beyond that. It is a structural and thinking and policy thinking, but it also is a cultural change. That is very important. If we do not have a peaceful culture, you know, for people and the relationships amongst each other. When we talk about human rights, we talk about villages and the people's human rights. And this is what we talk about in Vienna at the United Nations, that we have to understand the importance of the rights of the people that affects the collectivity and not only one person. It is very important to have that in mind. The indigenous people, that is everything that is happening with the armed forces and conflicts. And I am going to focus on something very concrete. And I'm going to give you as an example that there are governments that call themselves democratic, but they are not. The case of Paraguay and Colombia, we can talk about many countries, but I'm going to talk mostly about Paraguay's case. Many people have been murdered. 2 little girls who were 11 years old, and they were armed. They disguised them with guerrilla equipment, and they talked about just like what happened in Colombia. We had someone in Paraguay. We are in 11 countries of Latin America. We are present, and we sent investigation missions, and they were apprehended. Our colleagues of human rights defenders, and they were kicked out of Paraguay. And those who were responsible of these murders were the armed forces with the government's support. Also, the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl, Luchita, who until today we are trying to find where she is. We are not able to find out where she is. And it was also a repression against human rights organizations. So what are we doing in front of all of this? We can talk about Brazil, we can talk about Colombia. There were many who expressed all the investigation commissions in Colombia, but our experience to defend the human rights defenders, we generate networks in different countries, and many of us are survivors thanks to the international solidarity. This is important. The Protocol Esperanza, we are going to try to de-socialize it in organizations to see how it is going to be helpful in the judicial part, because we have been working not only when there's a torture or someone disappears or an environment, or the brutal repression that certain indigenous villages suffer from. This has to do with their culture. They take their lands. It is an unjust situation. Currently in Ecuador, we were just talking about Ecuador, the huge repression with death in Ecuador when the indigenous movement, La Conalle, Pachacute, and other organizations try to be heard, and the government refuses. Thankfully, at this time, there is a dialogue. So the international organizations, and I'm not going to take too long because I know that we don't have enough time left, but in the case of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, it always gets, you know, at the time when conflicts have already been resolved, just like the United Nations. We have fought and we have hit our heads so many times there at the United Nations, and we were able to get their participation, but very late. You know, or maybe doing some missions in hard times under dictatorships. But we are definitely trying to strengthen the judicial action in the case of the American Jurist Association or Commission. The lawyers who we have, many times they have risky professions, so there isn't yet a judicial mechanism for protection to these human rights defenders, also with journalists. Right now, we are launching an international action for the defense of Juliana Sanchez and her freedom. There are very logistical ways we are working with FEDAP, the journalist victims, but also the defenders, the environmental defenders. So we are on our way. You know, there is no recipe. So we welcome every approach, everything that you can add, because this is something that we're gonna have to push us to look for this judicial action, because in Argentina we fought a lot to be able to face this the humanity cases and injustice, and also the country that does it through the federal justice and not ad hoc justice like Nuremberg and Tokyo. And we have advanced. We just now are trying, and they're doing it here in Argentina, by the way. We are now facing the crimes during Franquismo. If there is no action, there is impunity. And we have to strengthen these actions. The Inter-American Council of Human Rights many times is not on the side of human rights, but the interests of the United States. You know, we have the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, who the other day, the Argentinian president in Los Angeles at the meeting, he literally repeated the renouncement. He renounced, and all international organizations, they are all in the United States, and I wonder why. From the International Monetary Fund and the Inter-American Commission, even the United Nations, and the representative of the United Nations explained, Diego Garcia, he explained the situation of so many countries, but especially the United States, who is the biggest human right violators, and they have the absolute power. They sign all the international treaties, but they don't ratify anyone. I think we have to change many things. We do not have the solution, but we have the obligation to defend the lives of people and villages. So the protocol Esperanza is welcome. We will try to share and see how we can all work together to defend life in our our countries and villages. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I just want to leave you with a lot of hope and strength. And what, like we say in Latin America, until victory, always.
Thank you, Mr. Pérez Esquivel, for your remarks.
Thank you.
And life work defending rights. We are out of time, so we're gonna leave the event here. On behalf of CEJIL, SWIFOR, and Protection International, we would like to thank this amazing panel. It has been a real treat and a pleasure to share this morning with you. I would like to thank everyone who joined on the Facebook live stream and to our interpreters for their great work. And we invite everyone, all the human rights defenders, NGOs, current and former mandate holders to use the protocol as a roadmap towards an integral protection of human rights defenders. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.